Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Mathieu in Washington. Thanks for coming along. The Thursday edition. Yeah, you made it to Little Friday. We have a lot of wood to chop here. Or should I say a lot of wine to drink? The big development this morning as we wait for more news on tariffs. Donald Trump going after the wine, the champagne, and the other alcoholic beverages from Europe. As you heard Charlie Pellet mentioning, it's moving the stocks. And boy, what a time to pick this, right? I thought we all stopped drinking because of the GLP-1s. Now this? You're going to take my Brunello di Montalcino away. As the president writes, the U.S. will shortly place a 200% tariff on all wines, champagnes, and alcoholic products coming out of France and other EU-represented countries. Yes, your Chateau Neuf de Pape could double in price. He says this would be great for the wine and champagne businesses in the U.S. Okay, so we're drinking California starting pretty soon, but you can't get champagne here in the U.S. And he knows that because, well, Donald Trump has his name on sparkling wine in Virginia, right? So Howard Lutnick making the rounds this morning because it's Thursday. Every cabinet secretary is on TV somewhere. In this case, the Commerce Secretary on Bloomberg TV talking about EU tariffs. Here's what he said.
The EU has just so many years treated us so harshly. They just can't stop. Look, their tariffs are way up here and our tariffs are down here. How about relax? Let us balance it. We are your largest, most important trading partner. Treat us with respect and let's get a little balance. And Donald Trump is out there saying balance, balance, balance. April 2nd, he's going to describe his balance. We're going to do it together.
April 2nd, of course, that's the date the reciprocal tariffs take effect. Howard Lutnick on Bloomberg Surveillance, making the case, beating the drum. As we now turn to Jenny Welch. Imagine at this moment being the chief geoeconomics analyst at Bloomberg Economics. What a time to have your business card. Great to see you. Thank you for coming in. This is happening as the president sits down with the NATO Secretary General, which I'll ask you about. We might even get a taste of their conversation a little bit later on this hour. But boy, this really gets back to the noise. And this hits home for people, right? My wine's going to double in price? That's sort of different than steel and aluminum, right?
Absolutely. I think this is also an interesting reminiscence of the previous trade war with Europe back in Trump's first term, where he also threatened French wine. Mm-hmm. At that point in time, they backed down from it. So maybe there is a chance that they'll back down from this as well, and we can avoid paying more at the liquor store. This
is a direct response, I guess, to the bourbon levies that we got from Europe. Yesterday, they went after Kentucky bourbon, blue jeans, Harley Davidsons. These are pretty narrow, though, right? And so is wine. I mean, are we tinkering around the edges here? When you talk about aluminum and steel, that's big business.
That's big business. And really what happened here is that Europe had snapback tariffs from that previous trade war. Mm-hmm. They just let them come back into play, and they're intentionally targeting these politically salient industries in the United States in counties that voted for Trump, right? It's a tactic that we've seen other players use, like China with agricultural tariffs as well. Yeah. The intent is to get him to back off. Obviously, this might lead to more of an escalation. And to your point, we were expecting April 2nd to be the main showdown with the reciprocal tariffs. We're already having an escalation just based off of the steel and aluminum. And I think that really highlights the volatility of this moment.
Well, he says soon, right? Shortly, he said, we'll place a 200% tariff on the wines, et cetera. I believe it was Jonathan Ferro who asked Howard Lutnick this morning, what's the timeline here? Didn't really seem to answer it. So again, are we just riffing? Or maybe that is part of the April 2nd reciprocal, or we have no idea?
Well, part of it, too, is waiting for the EU to make their full response. There's the snapback tariffs that have to come into place, but there's additional tariffs that the EU is going to be voting on later this month on top of those snapback tariffs from before. So maybe part of this is just the negotiation in public to try and walk the EU back before they have some of those internal conversations.
Look at this. Just as we're talking, producer James puts the headline here in front of me. EU Trade Commissioner to have call with U.S. counterpart on Friday. So we're drinking wine this weekend. Is that the European wine, maybe?
I would say buy it now, just in case.
Okay.
Stockpile.
What a moment we're in here. And now you're a geoeconomics analyst, and we frequently align you with geopolitics. Mm-hmm. not, trade wars over alcohol. Does this actually move the needle in your space?
I think everything that President Trump has been doing to date has been moving the needle in terms of how we think about economic coercion and economic statecraft toolkits, right?
Yeah, okay.
His willingness to use tariffs not just as an instrument of trade policy, but of all foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about geopolitics a little bit here, because this is a very serious meeting actually today at the White House. The Secretary General of NATO probably doesn't have household name recognition like, say, Emmanuel Macron or President Zelensky. But this is going to get to the heart of some real tension between the U.S. and Europe. As you've pointed out, a couple of things that we're going to be looking at here. It's going to involve trade, certainly, the tariff conversation we're having. But really, it's going to be about Ukraine and the U.S. commitment to NATO, which is a much bigger question when you think of it here.
Yeah, absolutely. This visit is taking place at a pretty stark time for Europe, where they're facing a trade war with the United States and also facing this pivot, essentially, that President Trump has undertaken over the last month of rapprochement with Moscow, putting a lot more pressure on Ukraine. Now there's been a successful meeting, it looks like, between U.S. and Ukrainian officials earlier this week that maybe has walked some of that pressure back. But I think Europe is still reeling from that pivot and thinking about what it means now for it to have to stand up for itself and uphold its own security without being able to rely on the U.S.
They're going to be in the Oval Office, at least by the schedule, 5 minutes from now, and things may well run a little bit late here. Much of this will have to do with the spending commitments, right, that NATO members make. Also, the veracity of Article 5. Donald Trump has recently questioned this again, suggesting that we may not defend allies who don't pay the full freight. He wants 5%. Is that the going rate now?
5% is above and beyond what most NATO members can reach. Poland is the country that's closest to it. Even the U.S. is well below 5%. And frankly, it would break the bank for a lot of European NATO members. That being said, they have raised defense spending over time, including since Trump put this pressure on them in his first term. But the challenge is really going to be how they do that while managing debt, how they do that with a defense industry that's much smaller than the United States. I mean, the prospect of Europe having to stand up for itself, that's not a 1 year, a couple months effort. It's something that will take many years to build up that capacity.
Yeah, this is quite remarkable. He was asked about this by NBC News. He said we would not protect NATO members who fail to meet these spending demands. Quote, it's common sense, right? If they don't pay, I'm not going to defend them, unquote. If you're the NATO Secretary General, how are you getting to this today in the Oval Office?
So I think one upside for the Secretary General is that he has also been urging European NATO members to spend more on defense and has echoed some of the higher numbers that President Trump has thrown out there. I think the other way he could potentially frame this as is the amount of benefits that NATO and NATO allies present to the United States in terms of cost cutting, right? The U.S. has bases in Europe that provide for U.S. security back at home. You're closer to Russian missile silos, for example. Sure. Second, those NATO members are kind of your front line. They're providing, sure, maybe not as much as you would like them to in terms of troops and weapons, but they are covering some of those costs for you. And third, just the prospect of NATO as an alliance and the deterrence value that creates with Russia, with China, with Iran is unmatched elsewhere in the world. No one else has that many allies that they can draw upon.
Right. How about that? In our remaining moment, I suspect that the Secretary General will make the case to Donald Trump that if Ukraine falls, it is more dangerous, it is more expensive to exist as NATO.
That would be the argument I would certainly make. And I think in particular, when you think about it from Russia's perspective, if Ukraine falls, what are its next targets? It's probably the Baltics.
Poland's on the front door.
Exactly.
Baltics are standing right there waiting for you. Estonia is listening closely to this conversation today, isn't it?
Yeah, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, they're all going to be watching very closely.
Yeah. There's a lot on the line here. Stakes are high, and that's usually when we bring in Jeanne Welch. Thank you so much, Jeanne. It's a great conversation, as always. Bloomberg Economics. Find Jeanne's byline on the terminal and online, of course, at Bloomberg.com. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We thank you for being with us here on the Thursday edition as we plow ahead with what's happening on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. We will bring you into the Oval for that conversation when it happens later on. But, of course, we've got to talk about a government shutdown potentially now in 2 days after Chuck Schumer said Democrats will not play along in the upper chamber. Do we believe them? We'll talk about this and what the economic impact could be with Tazra Mitchell coming up next right here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thank you for being with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio channel 121, and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. That's the drill. Find our live stream. Just keep it up running there all day. You can listen, you can watch, you can back it up. And we always welcome you, saving you a seat here in the studio in Washington. I'm Joe Mathieu. It's good to have you along here as we try to follow the bouncing ball on Capitol Hill, all the while keeping tabs on the White House. The president today meeting with the NATO Secretary General in the Oval. It could get chippy. We'll bring you in there when they get in there. But, not a lot of things in Washington happen on time. That could be the case, by the way, for a vote on a bill to avoid a government shutdown. Are they going to get this done? Maybe not. Things have become a lot more complicated over the past 24 hours here. John Thune did file cloture, the Senate Majority Leader, on this House-passed CR, the one we've been talking about. Last night, that means a cloture vote Friday. But wait, you say, government's supposed to shut down Friday night. It gets a little complicated when Chuck Schumer says Democrats are not going to vote yes for this thing, and that may not be the case in the end. But we've got a roadblock right now on the Democratic side. So a time agreement would be necessary to avoid at least a shutdown over the weekend, which might not be that big of a deal. The problem is, as Democrats watch the DOGE do its work, there's a big question about what would happen if the government actually was allowed to shut down. What would reopen? Maybe entire agencies would remain shut down. Certainly during the span of the closure, Donald Trump would be able to make those decisions. And we've talked about this before on the air with a lot of people who know a lot more about this than I do. The fact of the matter is presidents enjoy broad powers in spending discretion during a government shutdown. Right? We've talked about this with Mick Mulvaney along with a lot of other people. The Office of Management and Budget is in charge at that point, and they start using the money they have to operate the agencies they have. So park that right here as Democrats think about maybe voting no on this, and then consider what's about to happen to D.C., the District of Columbia, the federal city. You come here, you hang around, go to the Smithsonian and enjoy time with your family, look at the cherry blossoms every spring. Well, real people actually live here. And of course, they do not get a vote in Congress. That's where things get complicated because this budget plan, this stopgap, the way it's written, basically turns D.C. into a federal agency and dramatically cuts spending to the tune of like $1 billion, which is why we're already hearing threats by the mayor, not threats, warnings, that, hey, we may need to start firing teachers and police officers if this goes through. This is one of the reasons why Democrats say they want to vote no. Nobody put a finer point on this than Brad Howard, the Democratic strategist you hear about a lot, hear from a lot on Balance of Power. He was on the late edition from Corcoran Street Group. Here's what he said.
This money, they can't be used, this money, to calculate savings. This money can't be used for the federal government. It is our money. Essentially what it does is it gets diverted away from us for 6 months, and then they figure out later what happened. So it doesn't even calculate savings. So we're trying to figure out what happened here, why. It just seems, hopefully it's not just a mean-spirited attempt to thumb our nose at a Democratic jurisdiction, but I don't know how else to read it.
So wait a minute. This money is from people who live in the District of Columbia, and it's going to go somewhere else? That's what Brad is saying, and that's the prospect we're looking at. If you're listening to us right now on 99.1 in Washington, D.C., you probably know this. And what they're saying is, hey, make that happen. You get an instant recession in D.C. and right around the whole DMV. Yes, the DMV. District, Maryland, Virginia. Said to be recession-proof. This is what Tazra Mitchell's been working on. She's Chief Policy and Strategy Officer at the D.C. Fiscal Policy Institute. Where, Tazra, I'm guessing the House is on fire. Is this really about to happen?
Well, we hope that the Senate Democrats will ensure that D.C. gets to spend its own money. This extreme act of federal interference will negatively impact basic government services that we all rely on, from childcare to 911, touching every D.C. resident. And we are really leaning on them to prevent this from going into place.
What can be done other than Democrats voting no?
So unfortunately, D.C. lacks the power of statehood. We should have it, but we do not. So we are subject to congressional review of all of our legislation, including our own budget. DC has had a balanced budget for 28 consecutive years with clean audits. Unlike the federal government, we have to balance our budget. We have these $1 billion in revenues, and all we really need is for Congress to let us spend our money the way that we see fit and give us the same autonomy that localities across the country have. So what we're asking them to do is to ensure that whatever continuing resolution that goes through allows DC to spend its own resources as we see fit, including sticking with 2025 current budget levels. Because if they fail to do that, we're going to see layoffs of police, layoffs of firefighters, teachers, all of our workers that help run our city and keep us safe, which I think should be a top priority for both Republicans and Senate Democrats.
So it's important what you just said here. This is money that is actually raised from people who live in the districts of Columbia, it's not coming from Kansas, California, or Connecticut is the point here, right? So if it's money from the city, you're saying it should stay in the city. The problem is D.C. doesn't have a vote, which is why since the year 2000, if you ever look at the license plate in Washington, D.C., it says taxation without representation. It brings up the whole argument over home rule here, Tazra, and this could end up being a pretty difficult period for the district. Would it cause a recession?
It could very well cause we're already actually projected to face a mild recession in the district because of Trump's federal layoffs. Our own chief financial officer is already saying that our revenues are going to plummet by $1 billion over the next 4 years just because of federal layoffs alone. And now we have this additional $1 billion problem that would harm our economy, small businesses, and make it harder for everyday district residents to make ends meet. And as you said earlier in the clip, this will have ripple effects on the entire region. So Maryland and Virginia residents will also be harmed by this reckless and dramatic escalation among Republicans in Congress. And it's unnecessary.
So how will the city function?
Yep.
That's right. How does the city function if you fire teachers, police, you can't have 911 and the rest of it? What, we're going to live in Mad Max for the next couple of years?
Well, this is unprecedented. I think the mayor would have really hard choices to make that are forced upon her, something that she does not want to do. She said that we would have to cut $1 billion through September. That is about a 16% cut in our budget. That means probably thousands of fewer government workers that are keeping our streets clean, that are educating our children, that are making it safe for tourists to come and visit our great city. Just so many ripple effects. And, there are also looming federal cuts that may also be coming our way that would make it harder to put food on the table, care for children, just afford to live in the district. And again, this is unnecessary. We have the revenue and the bank. We are not projected to face a deficit. This is just reckless. This is an overreach. And again, just an attack on DC residents' rights as Americans in this nation.
Well, there's a bit to that, Tazra, and I'm sure that you can speak to the kind of resentment. Maybe we'll start with the misunderstanding that people have around the country of what D.C. is, who lives here, who's from here. They picture this massive bureaucracy, a bunch of guys with white shirts and skinny ties. They're not aware that there is, in fact, a Native community here in this city, that things other than the federal government take place here. But there's some truth to this resentment that people have to D.C., or sort of a lack of caring. I think some people actually enjoy watching this. Do you?
I think that D.C. has a rich culture. Go-Go was born here. We have great food. We have great community. And it's just like anywhere else in the nation. We raise our children here. We look out for one another. And we're doing our best to get by. And the last thing that we need is the congressional delegation, who really probably don't even know D.C. all that well and explore the beauty of our culture, coming in and making demands without having an ounce of understanding about how we run the district or how we what our finances are used for. Again, 28 years in a row, we've had clean audits. And for over 20 years, Congress has made the agreement with DC to let us spend our money as we see fit and protect us during shutdowns and protect us during continuing resolutions. It costs them $0 to continue that promise as they pass this continuing resolution. And just today and yesterday, you're seeing hundreds of residents going down to the Senate building and making their voices heard. And we hope that Senate Democrats are listening to them, as well as other Senate Republicans. Again, it will not save them a single penny. It will not cost them anything. They just have to understand the suffering that they are going to be causing on their neighboring residents in the district. And again, for no real reason.
Yeah. As Brad Howard pointed out last night, a lot of the D.C. population is made up of congressional staffers, the people who work for the lawmakers who are going to be voting on this thing. Lawmakers may fly back to another state on the weekends, but these people live here. They're chiefs of staff right on down to the pages on Capitol Hill. So this actually hits pretty close to home to the families that they have in their own offices. And I'd be deeply curious to hear what some of those conversations are like. Tazra, I'm really glad you could join us, and I appreciate your insights today. Tazra Mitchell, Chief Policy Strategy Officer at the D.C. Fiscal Policy Institute. Yeah, we're in the bubble here, but this has repercussions, certainly regionally. If we talk about the beginnings of a recession nationally, could it be rooted here in Washington? It's a different story than we've probably told in the past. They've started their conversation in the Oval Office, and as usual, you know the drill around here. We'll bring you in for the conversation a bit later between President Trump and NATO Secretary General Rutte. I also want to mention an important conversation we're going to bring you right here on Balance of Power. A half an hour from right now, the former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin sitting down with our own Saleha Mohsen here on Bloomberg. We'll set up our panel next. Their insights on everything we're talking about. Jeanne, Zaino, and Lester Munson are on the way in right here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
On the Thursday edition, it's Little Friday, and we've got our arms stretched around Washington here with activity on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue that require your attention here. As Charlie mentioned, we're going to have to start warming up to the California Pinot and Cab all over again, because the wine from the other side of the Atlantic may be about to get a lot more expensive. 200% tariffs, says the president, on your Chianti, your Brunello di Montalcino, your Vacqueras, Gigondas, and Chateauneuf de Pape. So, hey, look at the bright side. There's a meeting tomorrow, as we just heard. Trump White House meeting with the EU Trade Commissioner magically on Friday, knowing that reciprocal tariffs are set to take effect on April 2nd. This is all going to be part of a special conversation that we have coming up for you in about 20 minutes' time with the former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. You'll hear it live right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. In the meantime, we're watching the process unfold on Capitol Hill that, well, we have been told on a daily basis would not result in a government shutdown. Now we're told the odds are rising on a shutdown. We're going to have to bump into Nathan Dean and see where BI is on this, because things got a lot more complicated late yesterday. Chuck Schumer says Democrats are not playing ball, and a lot of it has to do with the conversation that we just had with Tazra Mitchell, the cuts that are happening here in Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, as well as the DOGE cuts at large. In many cases, the White House not spending money that was allocated and passed by Congress. So Chuck Schumer says Democrats have had it. Here he is from last night.
Funding the government should be a bipartisan effort, but Republicans chose a partisan path, drafting their continuing resolution without any input from congressional Democrats. Because of that, Republicans do not have the votes in the Senate to invoke cloture on the House CR.
Yeah, the math is tough. John Thune, who filed for cloture last night and has an actual cloture vote scheduled for tomorrow, needs at least 7 Democrats to make this work. We're watching you, Rand Paul, as well as our panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us right now, our Democratic strategist, of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow for the Center of the Study of the Presidency and Congress. And great to have Lester back. He's been around the world since we've last spoke. Lester Munson, principal of the international practice at BGR Group, our Republican strategist. Great to see both of you here. Jeanne, is this real? Democrats going to sit on their hands this weekend?
I don't know. I have to say, I hope not. I mean, this is the Hobson's choice of all time for the Democrats. There is no good option. So I am empathetic to the position they find themselves in. They feel strongly that this is a chance to push back on what is happening with DOGE. And you just talked about this, what the president is doing and all of that. And obviously they're out of power, so they don't get a lot of opportunities. But that said, I'm hoping they resist the temptation, because shutting down the government now would be a political win for Donald Trump and a disaster for Democrats, because there's nothing at the back end for them, particularly this ridiculousness of a 30-day CR. So I hope they resist the temptation. I'm not sure they're going to be able to do that because they are so frustrated.
As usual, Jeanne reaches for the news. This is what's going on here. Democrats are going to put up an amendment, their own CR proposal, that would extend government funding through April 11th. That'd be the 1 month CR here. Lester, I know that you have a sense of humor. Is this a joke here, or are we talking about a government shutdown?
I don't think it's a joke, although Jeanne's comments, wow. I think the 30-day extension is not a joke. It's an interesting option for Democrats, and what I'm hearing from my sources up on the Hill, particularly with that crowd, is they want to not give Trump a win here, but when push comes to shove on the actual vote, they don't want to be the ones who are closing the government. And so I think I'm right where Jeanne is. I think what you could see here is an interesting sequencing of the votes for Democrats. One of the things Republicans could do for them is, all right, we'll give you a little vote here to show that you don't really want the full year. You can vote on a 30-day, but then after that we're going to vote on the full extension of the CR for the rest of the fiscal year, and we're going to need you to vote, at least a few of you to vote yes on that. And that might be a nice way out of the wilderness here for everybody.
Did you just put up a countdown clock, James? If you're with us on YouTube, Jeanne, there's a countdown clock in front of you now. Are we the first to get the countdown clock? You know what that means? We're really going to have to get odds on this thing, Jeanne. Look at this right now. They're counting down to a government shutdown. If it happens over the weekend, it's not real, right? If this is like a 2-day thing and they get it back together by Monday, what qualifies as a shutdown? And I ask you that knowing that a lot of Democrats believe if the government shuts down, many agencies will never reopen as long as Elon Musk is in town.
Well, that's right. First of all, how great it is when producer James is in New York and he can put up countdown clocks, all these cool things. Love it. There is a chance we do see, and we've always talked about this, a very minimal short-term shutdown. Now, obviously, it has impact. It's not quite as broad as if we saw a huge one. The reality, though, is this is why this is a Hobson's choice for Democrats. If they shut down the government, and I'm not just talking politically, of course, they'll be blamed by the Trump administration. What's new? But the reality is they're giving DOGE exactly what they want. And this is one of the things we heard from Hickenlooper and others saying, and you just talked about this, Joe, then he gets to do what he wants to do. He's going to decide what's essential. And so, which really means Elon Musk will be doing it with him. So from so many perspectives, this is not good strategy, it is not good governing, it is not good politics. And boy, oh boy, it's so fun to be on with Lester, but can he please agree with me that vote he just described is the epitome of political nonsense theater? We're going to give you a vote, and we all know it's not going to pass, wink, wink, wink. Then you give us this, and then we go off for vacation. I mean, that is what is probably not going to satisfy anybody, including the Democratic base. So I don't know why they would do that, but they may very well do just what Lester said.
Pull us in off the ledge, Lester.
Jeanne, yeah, I I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but there's a lot of theater happening in politics lately, and I think it's about time Democrats started to embrace the concept and fight on the same kind of battlefield that Trump is on, where he's really running away with it. They need to figure out how to get up there and do the same kind of razzmatazz. And maybe this is a really nerdy thing to get out of this, but they need some sort of fig leaf, some way to show, hey, we're not really with this guy, but also we don't want to shut down the government. That, I think, people will understand a little bit. And if you need to do a little, two-step on the floor of the Senate, that's okay with me.
All right, we can do the Texas two-step. We do have a little bit of breaking news I need to mention here. Jeanne, this is important, and it will be a big story as this develops later on in the day, something you're going to hear a lot about. Federal agencies must rehire the probationary workers who were fired by the DOGE. This is coming from a federal judge in San Francisco ordering the Trump administration, Bloomberg Law is the first to get to it, to rehire thousands of the government's newest employees terminated in early February. Jeanne, these are the same people who were, in many cases, locked out of their computers, fired by email or voicemail, not allowed back in the building. This requires the VA, Department of Energy, Interior, Agriculture, Treasury to rehire the fired employees. Once again, Jeanne, the court is the check on the administration.
That's absolutely right. And this has been the story of what we've seen so far with DOGE is they have just, gone with this chainsaw through cutting the people that they could as easily as they could with the probationary workers, unfortunately. And then you have the court stepping in and saying that is, unconstitutional, illegal. They must be hired back. Imagine if DOGE had been well prepared to do what we all needs to be done, which is to make smart cuts to these agencies and to do it in a way that it increased efficiency, it increased responsiveness, it saved money. Instead, to go and just cut people because they were the last hired makes no sense. I mean, all of us know it's not usually the last person who was hired who's not being effective. Sometimes it's the person who's been there for 40 years who's not being effective. So that is no mark of getting rid of people who are inefficient. So from every perspective, this is such important news. And of course, to your point, the third branch stepping up to do what it needs to do, which is to hold the administration's feet to the fire when it comes to respecting the laws and the Constitution of the United States in doing its work.
Lester, weigh in on the ruling to the extent that you want to, but I'm kind of curious your reaction that we're seeing in the financial markets to all of the activities of the DOGE combined with the confusion over tariffs. We're selling off again here. The S&P's down another 1%. The NASDAQ is down 1.5%. We're getting closer to 5,500 on the S&P 500. I mean, we're beyond round tripping, as you know, to before Election Day. What do you make of this visceral reaction to the rhetoric out of Washington?
Well, I think we're seeing that little Trump bubble from late January, early February popping, and just after the election. So that's gone. I think this is largely about the tariffs and the confusion and the back and forth and the uncertainty. It's hard for businesses to plan. I mean, it's a crazy situation. I think to the DOGE spending cuts issue, I have a different take here, I think, than Jeanne. I think this is, and I do hope, I think like she does, that in the long run, there is an intelligent process here that is thought out and thinks about the things that we actually need to do and how we can do them in a more cost-effective way. And that's good. That needs to happen. It's probably going to be led by OMB and Congress going forward rather than DOGE, although DOGE can play a role. But I think for the last few weeks, what the DOGE process has done has enabled the president to get the CR through the House. It's distracted the Freedom Caucus, the real fiscal conservatives, from the actual situation with respect to the budget. The DOGE cuts don't actually result in any taxpayer savings. The money is still there. The CR that's going through basically keeps funding at a level, at a straight line going into for the rest of the year. And even these budget resolutions that Congress is about to consider with the reconciliation process show discretionary spending not going down over time. So there's like the real risk for Trump here is the fiscal conservatives, that they're going to bail out on his program. And he's using the DOGE cuts to kind of keep them on side. It's a little bit of a magic act where he's doing the DOGE as kind of the distraction while you're not looking on the other side, he's passing all these things through the Hill and getting Freedom Caucus to vote for him.
Yeah. We're going to keep doing the DOGE with Lester Munson and Jeanne, Zaino. Our panel will stay with us in our second hour. And as I mentioned, we'll bring you a conversation about all of this with the former Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, is going to be sitting down with Bloomberg's Munson right here in our studios in Washington. So stay with us as we welcome our global television audience to the conversation coming up as well here on the fastest show in politics.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We bring you an important conversation as here in Washington, D.C., the former U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is sitting down with our colleague, Munson. Saleha.
Thanks, Kailey. We have Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin with us here. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
You have a unique insight into this administration because you served all 4 years during the first term for President Trump. I wonder what you make of a difference that we're seeing with Trump this time around. He is a little less concerned about day-to-day market swings. We've seen big tariff talk, 200% tariffs, 25% tariffs, 10% across the board. And the S&P 500 has wiped out $5 trillion in part because of this. What do you make in the shift in Trump's thinking about markets?
I think the execution is slightly different, but I think the fundamental economic policies are actually the same. And this goes back to what the president campaigned on in 2016, tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade. And those are the same things you're hearing about today. I would say it's critically important that the tax cuts are extended, and I know President Trump wants to add additional tax cuts. He's always been very focused on trade. I think that you're seeing a more aggressive trade policy in this administration, and I think one of the questions is, does the president want to use this to negotiate, or does he want to use this to raise tariff revenue, which he's talked about significantly, which if he's going to do that and use that to create tax cuts or pay down debt, it is an interesting strategy for effectively creating a consumption tax on foreign goods.
Do you think that some of the tariff threats, pulling things back, bringing them back up, do you think that's a good policy?
Well, I think the market is adjusting to his negotiating, which I think in the beginning, the market thought that he wasn't serious about tariffs, despite the fact that I think, and I've been saying, he's very serious about tariffs. So I've suggested that if he wants to raise revenue, a 10% tariff across the board on everything would be very effective. They could score that as part of reconciliation, probably raise about $2.5 trillion, and that would be very effective in terms of creating tax cuts and paying down debt.
It's been a lot, though, for investors and business leaders and CEOs to absorb. What would your advice be to some of this constituency as they try to deal with and they get worried about all the stock market gyrations from these tariff threats?
Well, my first advice would be don't overreact. I know there's some talk about, are we going to go into a recession? I don't see us at all going into a recession. I think we could have a little bit of a slowdown in the economy as we pull back on government spending, but I don't think investors should be concerned about a recession. The second thing I would say is we came in with the market being fully priced. So I think a 5 to 10% correction on the S&P or the NASDAQ actually makes sense. The market's been really fueled by massive amounts of tech spending, particularly around AI. So some of this is a natural correction in the market, and some of this is the market worrying about tariffs and the impact on tariffs.
We're talking a lot about tariffs. You mentioned taxes as well. What do you make of Trump's strategy to do tariffs before tax cuts this year?
Well, I think it's just a timing issue. I think they're actually moving on what seems like an incredibly fast agenda, which is encouraging, that Speaker Johnson says he's going to get a bill to the floor before Easter, which, if that's the case, that includes both tax cuts and border, That's a very impressive timing. I mean, my concern about this one big, beautiful bill was it was going to take too long and that the president could get a quick, easy win on the border. And the tax issues, as you know, Soleil, are quite complicated. So these things have to be thought through carefully and balanced.
You, as Treasury Secretary in 2017, were the face of the administration's efforts to get that tax bill through Congress. Based on that experience and what you know and see now of Washington, what do you think the chances are that there will be a successful extension of the tax cuts that Trump seeks?
Oh, I definitely think there'll be a successful extension. I think it just depends what it includes. And look, we're very proud of the work we did in the first administration. And obviously, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was sweeping reform. I mean, it took all year because it impacted almost every single part of the economy. It dealt with domestic taxes. It lowered corporate taxes. It lowered individual taxes. It had business tax credits. Right now, they're dealing with a much smaller segment. The most important priority is, in my mind, extending the tax cuts, which from an operational standpoint is actually quite easy to do. And then they have to consider some of these other ideas that the president has thrown out and figure out how they could pay for them as well.
Do you think that the SALT cap is something that needs to be part of the bill?
Well, it only needs to be part of the bill if that's what you need to do to get Republican votes to get the bill over the finish line. So there's no question that, putting a cap on SALT was a fundamental issue that we thought of fairness, treating all the states similarly. Having said that, I recognize there's a small majority in the House. And this clearly impacts places like New York disproportionately, and I understand why the New York members want to see that raised.
So far, it seems like that might be one of the sticking points. Are there any other sticking points that you see bubbling up as this tax bill comes together?
I think the bigger issue is the pay-fors. So you have some people who say this should be scored against current policy and it doesn't cost anything. The traditional way of scoring this is against what's the current law. After with the reduction of the tax cuts, and that would be over $4 trillion. So obviously, if you score it that way, the pay-fors are very significant. I am concerned, and you've heard Treasury Secretary Bessent and others talk about the deficit. I think the deficit is our number one problem today. So I think that whatever tax cuts are passed, at least some of them have to be paid for.
That's one of the larger differences between 2017 when you worked on this and now that the deficit is just so big. How much harder does that make Bessent's job?
I think it's quite significant. And, if you put this in context, when we did this, the entire tax bill cost $1.5 trillion. There was about $500 billion that we thought that was the difference between dynamic and scoring. And there was another $500 billion of things that were extenders. So we thought the true cost was closer to $500 billion and that we could easily grow the economy to pay for that. You're now talking about an economy that's much bigger. The numbers are much bigger. So the personal side alone is over $4 trillion. So the pay-fors are much more significant. We also have a much bigger budget deficit. We had much more fiscal room in 2017, and we had lower interest rates. So the interest on the debt wasn't as big of a problem. So you add all those things up, and yes, it's more difficult today, but it's also simpler in that the tax cuts themselves are much simpler.
You know this so well. In 2017, you were a key negotiator. You were the face of the administration's efforts, like I said. How important do you think it is for the Treasury Secretary to lead the charge on tax bill creation and negotiations?
I think it's very important because it's the president's signature achievement, and extending it is critically important for the administration.
We got to know each other during those 4 years when you were in office, but one area that we never talked about that was never a big deal when you were there was the payments system. With your 4 years of experience, you know how sensitive and significant the work at the Bureau of Fiscal Service is. Are you concerned at all about DOGE's access to the payment system?
Well, let's step back and just talk about the payment system. And you're right, we didn't talk about it much. Treasury is a gigantic payment processor for the federal government. So this is an important part of Treasury, but Treasury's role, as you can think of, is the bank. So what Treasury does is it takes in files from other parts of the government. The other departments certify those files. Treasury makes sure that it's in the proper form that it can execute them, and it executes them. So it's not Treasury's job to determine whether those payments are good payments or bad payments. I'm very comfortable with what I understand Treasury Secretary has said in regards to the controls over the payment system. That's the most important issue. I think some of the things that Elon has said make a lot of sense. I mean, does it make sense that you put a category payment around the payment? Of course. Now, those are things that should be easily added. I will say what we did work on was the transparency issues associated with this, that we put up on the internet a system where you could see most of the government payments. So, I think a lot of this topic today makes a lot of sense. But I'm comfortable today the system appears to be very safe.
Do you think that investors should be worried about the U.S.'s ability to fulfill its debt obligations, considering how much activity there is around the payment system right now with DOGE in there?
I know there were some concerns about DOGE in the beginning. That seems to be taken care of and not an issue. Obviously, the bigger problem with the payments is going to be the government debt and the debt ceiling.
One thing I've noticed that Secretary Besson is doing that's a little bit different than years past is putting a focus on lowering long-term bond yields instead of looking to the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. I'm curious what you make of this strategy.
Well, I think he's right in the sense of a large part of the economy is tied to longer-term rates. So whether it's mortgages or other things, and whether it's the 5-year or the 10-year, there's a large part of the economy. For a long time, we had a very flat yield curve. Ultimately, what the Fed does will have an impact on long-term rates. I think if you actually look at the market today and you look at the dot plot, the Fed is telling you basically their expectation is that they will lower rates down to 3.5%. It's just a question of when they get there. Right now, that's projected next year. And I think the 10-year Treasury already has that priced in. So I think it's built into the market today.
In the last couple of weeks, we have seen yields drop due to recession fears. Do you think that Besson might be getting what he wanted, but for the wrong reasons?
Well, I think he wants long-term treasuries to come down, and I think part of that is around creating, as there's less government spending, there's no question, and they can convince the market that they're going to cut the deficit. That will help long-term rates. But, I'd say, look, the 10-year has been bouncing around in a 20 basis point range, which I consider to be a market range.
One of my favorite things to ask current and former Treasury Secretaries is about currency policy, something that we've spoken about as well. We're expecting, at least in the next couple of weeks, the first foreign exchange policy report coming out of the Treasury Department. When you were in office, you labeled China a currency manipulator. I wonder if you think that that is an effective tag to apply.
I think it's one of the effective tags to apply. It's not the only effective tag, but I think it was one of the tools in the toolbox. And now it's more fun talking about currencies because I think, as you know, kind of like Treasury Secretary 101 is everybody's supposed to just say, oh, strong dollar, strong dollar. As you remember, when I was at Davos, I made for the first time a comment more on a stable dollar and the benefits of a strong dollar and the problems with a strong dollar, and the market reacted accordingly. But I really do think the policy should be a stable dollar policy. That's what's good for the U.S. That's what's good for the world. I think the dollar will be the reserve currency for the foreseeable future. But you don't want a dollar that's too strong that hurts us from an economic standpoint.
Well, you can speak much more freely about currency policy now. Thank you so much for joining. Kailey, back to you.
All right, Saleha Mohsen with the former U.S. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin live here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Fascinating conversation, especially in light of the developments, Joe Mathieu, that we have gotten on trade just within the last, 6 hours as President Trump is now threatening to retaliate for Europe's retaliation to his original steel and aluminum tariffs. We're now talking about a potential 200% levy on things like wine coming from European nations, in addition, of course, to all of the other economic elements that factor into the president's agenda, tax policy well included in that.
That's true. And it's, of course, happening against the backdrop of a meeting today with NATO's Secretary General. Kailey, they are still in the Oval Office, and this has been going on now for well over a half an hour. And it's a conversation that is keying off tariffs to some extent. The president made clear in advance this would not just be a NATO conversation, a Ukraine conversation, but one about trade. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.